Chapter 8. Embrace the Change. DJ watched the group in front of him begin to form a line across the valley floor on the opposite side of the clearing. It was painfully obvious what was about to happen. They would advance in unison and flush him out of hiding. They would drive him forward into the guys waiting at the cabin. Having little choice, he turned and headed his way back towards his mountain home. He moved quickly, having traversed it twice before, and was more certain of the terrain now. If he allowed himself to be flushed into the wide-open section opposite of the house, he would stand no chance at all. The concealment of the trees was his best and only hope, but he only had a limited amount of space to hide. He cut across at an angle to get as close to the southern canyon wall as possible. If he could isolate one of the soldiers stalking him, he might have a fighting chance. But if he were spotted by 2 or 3 of them in the middle of the wooded section, it was game over. Arriving at the rocky wall, he next sought out a good tree for climbing. Locating a likely candidate, he hastily began to remove his gray button-up work shirt. He carefully tucked it into the branches of a small juniper tree growing just underneath. He pulled it and shaped it into a loose man-shaped bundle of cloth. Next, he chose a decent-sized rock from the base of the cliff. He found one about 10 inches across. It was roughly shaped like a hard-edged football. Finally, bare-chested, he began his ascent up the tree. With one hand he cradled his rock. It was the most lethal thing he could find to defend himself with. It was a seemingly puny weapon of choice against an army of assault rifles, but what else could he do? With his free hand, he began to haul himself up through the branches. He was able to make it about 18 feet off the forest floor. He had just gotten into position, keeping the tree trunk between him and the approaching line of soldiers, when he heard the first sounds of someone creeping through the trees. He held his breath, closed his eyes, and listened as intently as he could. As he concentrated, he could make out multiple someones moving slowly through the undergrowth. He could hear at least 2 further away and one getting closer. From the sounds, it seemed they would move a bit and then pause to take in their surroundings as they looked for him. He thought he could hear the closest softly speak, but he couldn't tell what was being said. He had seen the radios mounted on the back of their tactical vest and assumed they had earpieces for communication. He willed himself to be as quiet as possible, to become part of the tree against which he was hiding. He only had one chance to get this right. Get it wrong, and he was likely to become a shirtless, hanging target. More movement in his direction. He turned his head. He dimly made out one of them about 60 feet away, ghosting through the undergrowth. A darker shadow of movement on the shaded forest floor, seeking him out, almost even with him now. Beneath him, another figure emerged, weapon raised, pointed into the small juniper, and right at the shirt he had placed there as a decoy. He waited but a split second more and then stepped off the limb. Wind hummed past his ears as he fell through the air, and he half expected for the guy below him to somehow sense his presence and move. The rock was held over his head in both hands, and as he rapidly descended on his unsuspecting target, he began to swing it downward. It was time to smash into the head of the figure below him. Surprisingly, it was the first time since this ordeal had begun that everything went according to plan. His crude weapon connected to the skull of his pursuer with a muted crunch of bone. Blood shot outward in a circle, bathing the surrounding area, including DJ, and a crimson splatter of instant death. Both he and his victim fell to the ground. DJ instantly froze and turned his attention to the direction of the second figure he had seen, looking for movement, ears focusing on the sudden crashing of people through the trees as they headed towards him. But nothing. The woods had gone still. As he let his senses probe the forest around him, his medic background made him check his victim for a pulse. It was there for a moment. Just a soft, brief flutter, and then gone. Carefully, but with as much speed as he could muster, he unsnapped the N4 from the combat sling attached to the tactical vest. He checked it over. One mag was loaded. A quarter pull backwards on the charging handle revealed a round in the chamber. Mounted on the top was a high-dollar holographic optic. As he quickly looked through it, he was met with a glowing red reticle to tell him it was on and ready for use. He expected nothing less, but he wanted to be certain there were no surprises should he have to start shooting. Still no movement. Still silent. Next, he removed the tactical vest and placed it on himself, clipping the rifle to the combat sling. He finished it all off by placing the earpiece from the radio in his ear. He caught the very end of a conversation on the other end. "Remember, he's unarmed. Should be a piece of cake, but keep your eyes open." Kneeling over the body, DJ raised the weapon and sighted into the bushes looking for targets. He saw nothing, but his ears caught stirring in the undergrowth again. With relief, he realized they were headed away from him. He had two choices. He could advance along the line of soldiers and try to take them out one by one from behind. And chances are he could get maybe 2 or 3 of them before they were all over him. Or he could head back towards the entrance where there were only 5 guys to deal with. DJ laughed inwardly at the motion. Only 5. Jeez. The odds were better for him there. 5 guys behind him, or 14 in front. 17 if you included the original 3 that he started with. Seemed like a simple equation to choose from. He snatched his shirt from the juniper, stuffed it in between the vest and his chest, and started back towards the entrance. He moved carefully, because he was still uncertain of where Soul Patch and Skinhead were. Had they moved forward with the 10 towards the cabin? Were they still stationed along the road at the clearing? Or had they chosen some other option? He arrived at the second clearing and paused, looking for the 2. Seeing nothing, he removed the inform vest in favor of putting his shirt back on. He noticed that his neck and chest were splattered with blood. It had failed to dry due to the sheen of sweat that had developed on his upper body. It was a lot of blood, he noted. He was sure he looked horrible. Suiting back up, he looked for the other 2 a final time, and then headed across. That is when the radio fired back up again with chatter, and he took a knee in the field to listen. They had not found him yet, and had reached the expanse across from his cabin. After conferring with each other, they started to sweep through. There was no that DJ called Paradise. He listened as the snipers, plural he noted, were instructed to stay at the cabin. There was no way he could sneak into the house and arm himself with the weapons he stashed there. No need now, DJ thought to himself. He was very well armed as it was. DJ inventoried the tactical vest he was wearing and found it loaded for combat. The left-hand side contained a silent Sig Sauer 9mm in a cross-draw holster. It was one that he owned and was familiar with. Above that, hidden in a patch near the shoulder, was a clip-on 3x multiplier for the rifle optic, a small scope that paired with a holographic sight for longer distance shooting. The right side contained 3 double-stacked magazine pouches, 3 larger pouches for the M4 and 3 smaller pouches sewn on top for the pistol. With the mags already seated in the weapons, that gave him 120 rounds for the rifle and 90 for the pistol. Plenty enough firepower to defend himself. On the back right-hand shoulder was a digital radio with a short, stubby antenna poking out of its pouch. It was linked to his ear with a short, coiled cable. Finally, around the small of the back, was a larger pouch that contained emergency medical supplies. Perfect, he thought to himself. He continued his trek east, moving carefully, and watching for the 5 he was sure to meet before he got to the entrance. By the time he arrived at the wrecked Jeep, conversation over the radio told him that they had finished a slow sweep of the field across from his cabin, and were now heading into the final section. It was garbled and broken up from the distance and the terrain, but he could make out enough to get the gist. Odds were, once they entered that final section, he would hear nothing at all on the radio, at least not from that bunch. He moved forward another 15 minutes with no issues. Then, as he finally approached the entrance, moving at only a cautious single step through the trees, the 5 must be close. He stopped, closed his eyes, and listened. Breeze, birds, the buzzing of insects here and there. Nothing to indicate a human, however. He began to slowly move laterally across the canyon towards the road and the van, 1 or 2 steps at a time, then pausing to listen. He repeated that process over and over until he stood next to the road in the shadows of a tall pine. Up ahead, about 20 yards away, the van sat in the middle of his road, pointing away from him. He could make out the form of someone sitting in the driver's side seat in the driver's side mirror. Whoever it was had both windows down to allow a breeze to ventilate the cab. Otherwise, he would have never been able to see anything through the heavy tint on the windows. Still hearing nothing, he made a decision. The small army behind him was too far away to hear any silenced gunfire. They also appeared to now be out of radio range. He needed to know where the other four were, so it was time to make them move. He raised the rifle and sighted it where he imagined the back of the driver's head to be, concealed on the other side of the tinted black glass. Chink! The M4 was obviously loaded with subsonic ammunition and made very little noise as it sent its projectile towards the driver. What was heard very clearly through the surrounding area, however, was the bolt of the rifle ejecting the spent casing and loading the next round, metal slapping against metal. Additionally, the bullet shattered the back glass and punched a ragged hole through the windshield as it passed all the way through the vehicle and its occupant. All of that made enough noise to let anyone in 100 yards know what was going on. DJ had just taken one more fighter out of the equation. He watched in satisfaction as the driver's head snapped forward and the jacketed hollow point bathed the front windshield and dashboard in red splatter. The humanity in him should have triggered some sort of shock to his conscience. He should have been at least somewhat horrified by what he had just done. This was the second life he had taken in a day. The first had happened while he was focused on staying alive and avoiding detection. There was no time to really process what he had done by smashing a man's brains in with a rock. But this one, it allowed him to think about his actions, and the emotions that he had felt was satisfaction? He questioned himself. Was he so broken now that there was little difference between him and these criminals? There was no time to come up with that answer, as a radio linked to his ear fired up with chatter from the remaining 4 soldiers hidden around him. Who had fired, they wanted to know. Did someone shoot at the van? They tried to reach the others further in the canyon, but they were too far away now. They then took a roll call by sounding out their names. Carter, Ash, Phillips, Hernandez. The 5th voice never sounded off, having been silenced by DJ. One of them took charge and instructed Ash to check out the van. After a couple of seconds, DJ saw movement to his left, across the gravel road, and he snapped his M4 in that direction. A black-clad form began to slowly emerge from the trees across the road. Chink, chink! DJ fired 2 quick shots at what he believed to be the chest area. The figure jerked from the impact, and then DJ could make out the body clearly as the figure's arms began to flail. Chink! He sent 1 additional round through the man's head. 26 rounds left in the M4. 3 remaining soldiers guarding the entrance. 3 bad guys taken out of the equation. Briefly, DJ wondered if the larger group deep in the canyon had discovered they were missing a man yet. The radio fired up again. Report, the voice that had taken charge ordered across the radio. Ash? More movement from multiple locations to his right on his side of the road. He hunkered down closer against the large pine and waited for a clear shot. A figure moved quickly from cover, then dropped down to take a knee behind another pine and focus on the van. Time to see DJ aiming at him. Chink! A hollow point round took him just above the ear and continued into the undergrowth beyond. A ricochet could be heard in the distance as DJ watched the guy fall over motionless on his side. 25 rounds. 2 bad guys left. DJ bolted from his position. In 2 large strides, he crossed over the road. The 3rd and 4th carried him into the trees on the opposite side. He slid down on his side, then rolled over behind the cover of a tree trunk. Aiming back across the road from where he came, he watched for more targets to show themselves. Over the radio he heard, Carter! Silence was the reply. Phillips! The voice asking seemed to have a Hispanic accent. DJ reasoned that it must be Hernandez talking. Here, Phillips answered. Did you see him? I think I saw him cross the road, Phillips answered. But the van is blocking my view from this angle. I thought he was unarmed. Hernandez replied. Bad intel or he took one of us out. There was silence for a minute, then Hernandez called us out. Called out for help from the others. Team 2, this is Team 1, over. The radio crackled in reply. Someone could hear and made an attempt to reply, but they were still too far away to get a good signal. It was garbled and sporadic. Again Hernandez tried. Team 2, this is Team 1, over. This time it was met with pure silence. Team 3, come in. Nothing. From his prone position behind the tree, DJ waited patiently. His eyes swept up and down the gravel road. He tried to reason out where the remaining 2 were. He thought one of them might be somewhere directly across from him, but deeper in the woods. Phillips mentioned that the van was blocking his view, so he figured that guy was further up, also on the other side of the road, with a van between him and DJ. Hernandez took charge again and gave an order. Okay, you cross over and I'll cover. Copy? Roger that. Call it out. Phillips replied. 3, 2... DJ was offered a correction when Phillips bolted from cover to cross ahead of the van. He sent 2 quick rounds into the guy as he crossed, and Phillips twisted from the impact to land in the bushes on his side of the road. He could hear the guy gasping for breath, so he knew he was wounded but still alive. Pine bark flew next to his head as a bullet meant for him tore into the tree he was hiding behind. He swung back to the right to look for the source. A second round tugged at the shoulder of his vest on his right-hand side. It missed him, but it was as close as it could get without impacting flesh. He finally saw the guy as a third round whizzed past his right ear, sickeningly close. Chink! He watched as Hernandez's head snapped back, and then his lifeless form collapsed forward into the dirt. From his left, he could hear Phillips try to move as he continued to gasp for breath. DJ stood, and he could see the end of the man's legs, still lying in the road, slowly kicking gravel. The rest of him was partially concealed from view in a bush. He took aim, moved to his right, and into the road as he did. As soon as he got a clear view of the dying man's head, he released a round and put him out of his misery. 22 rounds remaining. Team 1 was dead. He paused for a moment to silently consider his victory. An emotion began to wash over him like warm water. It was a feeling like he had not felt in some while. It had been so long. It had been so long that it took a moment to even recognize what the feeling was. It was happiness. But not just joy only. There was anger still there too, he realized. That raging beast he had let loose while sitting in the Jeep, taunting the others to follow him, was still hulking through his brain. But the beast had been saddled and was being ridden by pure pleasure. It was a weird marriage of emotions, to be sure. He was changing, becoming someone else, something else. He could be scared to death by what he was becoming, or he could embrace scared to death by those emotions, should be scrambling behind the wheel of the van and racing back towards town and the sheriff's office. That's what a sane person should do. He turned and faced back towards his cabin and the 17 killers that wanted him dead. Only a crazy person would head back that direction. Back towards town was normality and sanity. However, that direction also included the pain and hurt that had chased him since losing his wife and kids. The direction of the cabin meant that he would continue changing into something that should be feared. It could possibly mean that he would no longer be any different than the killers that pursued him. Bizarrely, it was a strikingly easy decision to make. He went to each body and began stuffing extra magazines from both the M4 and the pistol into every available pocket and pouch. He searched the bodies in the van for anything useful. He found a large knife he liked the feel of, as well as a few power bars. He confiscated a tactical flashlight and shoved it into his back pocket as well. A search of the van produced a hard plastic box. Containing night vision goggles. So he removed one of those and an extra pack of batteries. Then, hungrily devouring a power bar, he stepped into the shadows along the road and began making his way back up the valley towards his cabin. Embrace the change, he thought to himself.